Yeah, it's just started now, I think. Okay. But if you can hear me okay. I know you won't be able to see me. We're having a bit of problems with the camera, but audio should. Yeah. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the alternative tutorial arrangements, given the chaos that's going on just now. So today we're going to be covering the subject of water security over the next hour or so, 50 minutes, give or take. And the main mechanism for you guys to participate in this is the live chat. So if you can leave comments and questions in there, um, and if any comments and questions you do leave, I'll read out or I'll attempt to answer them. Um, and if the regular comment section is working as well, which it ought to be, you should be able to create your own threads in there, and feel free to do so. Okay, so if you want to get the chat started, then the first question I have is just an introductory one, and it's very, very basic. So just if you could give a couple of words on what your understanding of water security is, what makes this a discrete issue within international security and indeed inequality. And just while that comes through, just so there isn't too much dead air while you guys are having a think and typing stuff. Just wanted to go over a couple of the very interesting case studies from the lecture and from the podcast. So we had quite a few. We had the situation with the water crisis in Bangladesh, Egypt and Ethiopia is another one. The situation around Lake Chad, which of course borders Chad and a number of other countries, including Mali. Um, there's also the very important question of China and the Tibet Plateau. There's the intractable conflict in Israel and Palestine, and another case study of what happens when water resources are abused to the point of no return is the case of the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union, specifically Uzbekistan. Now, the Aral Sea was originally a very, very large internal sea in Central Asia, which had provided an agricultural source of water for centuries. However, under the Soviet centralized agricultural program, this part of the world was earmarked for cotton growth, and cotton growth, of course, being incredibly deleterious to water supplies because it's so intensive, and subsequently with this being with this kind of crop being forced into an area which hadn't traditionally had uh, cotton growing in it, and which took up a great deal of the water, what you ended up with was actually environmental degradation on a massive scale. And you only need to Google pictures of Uzbekistan now in the area around the Aral Sea. It still comes up as blue on things like Google Maps, but really it's more salt flats than anything else at the moment. And with regard to China and the Tibet Plateau, this is going to have all sorts of knock-on consequences because as glaciers melt, and this is related to the climate change talk we'll be having tomorrow, but as glaciers melt, this changes the rate of flow of major rivers into Asia, such as the Mekong, the Yellow, and the Yangtze rivers, and changes patterns of irrigation, and actually is reducing the ability of these deltas to produce crops in the same way that they had. Now, the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers were always the kind of the wellspring of Chinese civilization because they provided a vast amount of fertile crops which could support a large and industrious population, and that was true 25 centuries ago in the Han period as it is today. If that, however, stops being a part of the world that is so agriculturally fertile, and which does not yield as much as it once did with China's current population, this could cause major issues of food security as well. So water security really does impact a great deal. Okay, I'm just. I see a couple of you are on already. Excellent. Okay, so if you could just start typing then in the comments your basic understanding of water security, what you think about it, and perhaps what role does geography play, and what geographical factors can affect water security. So, for example, being on the upper riparian or the lower riparian of a river system, i.e., being upstream or downstream. Uh, can having a coastline make a big difference as well? This sort of thing. And just post those in the live stream whenever you can. SKK, thank you very much for that. I've created two. Right. 1 second. Kaylee. Two. If I've created two, I'm just going to try and fix that problem now. Apologies, this is the first time I've run such a thing, and there's going to be a couple of glitches. Okay, just to let you know we're still live. I'm just trying to sort that out and make sure there's not two streams going simultaneously. Okay, I think that should be there's only one live now. Okay, can is there only one running now then? If you could just let me know in the chat. I see we've got 26 current viewers. That's kind of upped the numbers a bit, so hopefully that's all fixed now. Yeah, hope so. Okay, so just while the chat catches up there and you guys start giving a little, hopefully you can give a little feedback there. So while you think about those questions, and just to repeat them once again, just if you could say in a few words, what is your understanding of water security, and what are the rules that? stream keeps freezing and okay. Yeah, if the stream keeps freezing and loading, I'm sorry about that. I don't know if that's my internet. Uh and if that is the case, there's not really too much I can do about that. So my apologies there. We'll just have to carry on as best we can. Okay, so Awesome Emu 13. I have a question on the water relations between Turkey and Iraq. Why haven't other nations intervened with Turkey as the state has drained the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for Baghdad and Basra in Iraq? That's an excellent question. That's a very, very good question. In terms of why haven't other nations intervened, I would say that's probably because there's been so much going on in that region of the world. It's incredibly difficult uh, to kind of focus on something like that when there's the Syrian civil war going on, when the priority for years has been clearing out ISIS, and Turkey's and as Paul points out, Turkey is actually a pretty powerful state. It's also a sort of a NATO actor as well. There have been a lot of tensions between the US and Turkey recently over Syria, and that would potentially just add another one to the list. But it's a very good question, and it'd be great to see some research on that too. So yeah, thank you very much. Oh, excellent! Great to see David Toke is in the chat and helping me out answer questions. That's brilliant. Thanks, David. The other thing is as well, it's worth remembering is that the nation with the most incentive to do something about Turkey acting in this way would be Iraq, but Iraq's government is, to use a charitable description, quite fragile at the moment. So whilst I'm sure that is a major policy priority for them, it's going to be one that needs to come up in its own time. There's a great number of other things that are existential threats to the Iraqi government that they're going to be focusing on first. Ahmadistanis Elios made the point that one of the readings was about Palestine. That's absolutely right, and I'm sure we'll come to Palestine in its own time. But yeah, I mean, to actually give some time to Palestine and Israel right now until I'm just sorry. Sorry if I keep stopping randomly, guys. I'm just trying to keep up with the chat as well and make sure everything's on point. Yeah. So Israel and Palestine. I mean, feel free to drop in some comments on this. It's obviously one of the most intractable conflicts in the world, and water plays a large part in it. Largely because there's not a great deal of fresh water in this part of the world, and by controlling the Sea of Galilee, Israel effectively controls most of it. And actually, a lot of Israel's actions since the partition in 1947, but certainly since the Six Day War, have been about ensuring water security. For example, in 1967, in the Six Day War, when Israel took the Golan Heights from Syria, which are just north of the Sea of Galilee. Part of the logic of it was by commanding the heights, you can protect the Sea of Galilee and prevent Syria from attacking farms and various irrigation networks from the high ground. So again, this kind of highlights how water security plays into this. And likewise, as the to look from the Palestinian perspective in Gaza, as the infrastructure in Gaza keeps shutting down, keeps degenerating over time. One of the main issues has been not just the provision of fresh water, but water for sanitation. And the sewage system in Gaza has more or less entirely broken down at this point, and Gaza, therefore, is becoming slowly unlivable. It's a city which has resembled a siege for many, many years. Um, but what will ultimately render it completely unlivable will be if the final kind of last legs of water processing go. Chiara Gerard makes the argument that the upper lower riparian dynamics strike me as a source of conflict that could have happened in the Neolithic period and hasn't changed much in essence. It just got more complicated with damming and agriculture. I mean, that's absolutely bang on, Chiara. Um, this is one of the most fundamental geopolitical issues which has affected human behavior really since the founding of agriculture, because with the founding of agriculture, that's when humans start settling in one place in significant numbers, and this is always done close to water sources. SKK 1234567. Iraq have heavily damaged water infrastructure as a result of targeted attacks during the war. It's one of the major barriers to aid and recovery. Yeah, absolutely. Uh, Paul, it seems like a realism-based interpretation could be made here. States and power over international organizations that would stop them. Seems a fair observation. Okay, we've got some really good comments and points being made in the chat, so just keep it up, guys. This is absolutely excellent. Just for those of you who might have come in the last couple of minutes, yeah, there's no picture, and we're going to be leaving it like that. Initially, we were having some problems with the camera, but now we might be having some problems with the bandwidth as well, and a picture would just overload that completely. So apologies for the blank screen. I know it's not the most visually stimulating of images, but we're kind of all making do here. And thank you very much for logging in and joining in the tutorial today to everybody who has. It's great to see you guys willing to work with us and doing things a little bit differently from how we've been doing them as a result of the coronavirus. Amadistanis. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation of that, by the way. You're quite welcome, and ask as many as you like. We'll be doing this for another 30 minutes or so. So please, all of you, feel free to ask as many questions as you like. And just while I'm waiting for a couple more of those to come in, what have we not covered yet? We've done Egypt, Ethiopia, Aral Sea and the Soviet period. We've talked a little bit about Israel, Palestine, and China and Tibet. Some of you may not have been around for those. Those were slightly earlier in the stream, so if there's any questions or comments you have on those, please feel free to just drop them in the chat. Paul, is water seen as more of a military asset as a civil need? It seems in terms of Palestine and Israel, it is an asset that can be used. Well, if you consider water as both a an absolute need, and from that you have two kind of concomitant conditions. By possessing it, you're at a strategic advantage. By not having it or denying it, you're at a strategic disadvantage. So if you are able to deny an adversary access to water resources, you are at a pronounced strategic advantage. Sorry. And likewise, if an adversary can cut off your water supplies, you're at a pronounced disadvantage. However, one thing that's worth considering is precisely because water is such an existential security issue. Actually, it's been the case that sometimes nations are quite loath, even in times of war, to escalate to a level of threatening water supplies because it's so important. And the particular issue I'm thinking of here is India and Pakistan, because though there have been clashes and issues surrounding control of the Indus River, where India is technically the upper riparian state, the Indus River Treaty has remained more or less unviolated since its inception. There are a couple of rare examples, but basically because it's so strategically important. And since both sides have acquired nuclear weapons and a nuclear state is one which cannot be made desperate, the ability to threaten supplies of water become a less strategically viable instrument, precisely because it's so important. Uh, Ahmadistanas. Part of me thinks the water situation is just another way of Israel taking Palestinian assets, which would make logical sense if they've been stealing land bit by bit. I mean, in terms of controlling that part of the world, certainly, if you if you determine kind of the goal of the Israeli state as to basically um, produce that kind of greater Israel and control both the land that was allotted to them in the 1947 partition deal, but also the land allotted to the uh, Palestinian groups as well, then that would be a logical outcome of doing so. Whether or not this is actually the case or the driving directive by the on the part of the government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is unclear, because I mean a lot of settlements tend to come from um, they're not they tend to be sort of bottom up rather than top down. So although they have been tolerated by the Israeli state, I believe since the peace deal's on the table now, there's a moratorium on kind of building new settlements for another 4 years. But it tends to be kind of uh, frontier groups of settlers who go out and kind of create these settlements in the West Bank. But if this was a state-sponsored action, then certainly controlling vital assets like water is what one would expect to see. Just a matter. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for that. So another interesting thing with water security as well is you have these two conditions of absolute scarcity and relative scarcity, which are worth chatting about because when it comes to absolute scarcity, there are relatively few political units, states, or actors out there who have or suffer under conditions of absolute water scarcity, which is to say, an absolute absence of water, or certainly very, very little water. Whereas relative scarcity is a bit more complicated. A lot of political units and actors suffer relative scarcity, which is to say, water is available, but it's incredibly resource intensive to extract, utilize, and disperse it to where it needs to be. And a great example of this is desert countries which have a coastline. Now, deserts are, of course, places of general water scarcity. But if they have large coastlines, and I'm thinking of states like Saudi Arabia, Oman, Yemen, Morocco, Algeria, places like this, um, well, desalination technology exists and is developing all the time, which is the ability to extract salt from seawater on an industrial scale and therefore provide fresh water. However, it's incredibly expensive and therefore is not really necessarily economically viable for smaller or developing states, but could seriously be an option for larger and better developed states depending on their economic arrangements. Paul, well, now that a lot of people are falling in ill to a virus, it might be times like now more than ever that securing water for sanitation and keeping the sick hydrated is important. Yeah, yeah, there'll be water security dynamics to this, absolutely. Um, because there is likely to be a greater demand. I mean, even little things, if replicated enough, can create changes on the systemic level. For example, the government's advice, although it's good advice, to wash your hands for 20 seconds at a time, much more frequently than one would otherwise do. Well, if a population on the scale of millions is doing that and they're using a lot more water than they otherwise would have, that is inevitably going to start creating quite significant demands on the system. Kiara, the California video showed chronic underinvestment in infrastructure across US, not just limited to water, and selfishness of the very richest. Beverly Hills residents complaining about $1 more tax. So California is an interesting example, isn't it? Because and you're absolutely right, this applies to infrastructure in general, certainly not limited to water and certainly not limited to just California. But California is a fascinating one because we associate the US and especially California with being sort of very bountiful and very much a land of plenty, and yet acute water shortages have been present for decades. Um, and how those resources are used and uh, how they are kind of shared up and disseminated and balanced is really quite interesting because you have cases where there's chronic shortages in cities. You know, the LA River is or the river that runs through Los Angeles is barely a trickle a lot of the time, and yet you have golf courses everywhere. You have agriculture of incredibly water intensive crops. You have all sorts of other kind of uses of water which come across as potentially illogical when you're dealing with acute relative shortage. And worth noting that even in somewhere as affluent as California, mass provision of potable water via desalination is not something which has been done. Not because the government couldn't afford it, but because it's simply not at that level of economic viability. But I'm sure if need were to create a demand for such a thing, it could probably happen. With places like Gaza, without such things, this makes them vulnerable to the virus. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, although one thing with Gaza, to be absolutely brutally frank about this, looking at the dynamics of coronavirus, this is very much small potatoes compared to the sicknesses which are rife within Gaza that are going to be much worse and related to uh, poor opportunities for sanitation, inability to keep properly hydrated. So things like typhoid, cholera. These things are a fact of day-to-day life, and within a context of that, things like coronavirus is scarcely going to be noticed, really. Leah McCrea, I have a question about the US. Surely the situation in California is some sort of human rights violation. How can they be allowed to provide citizens with unsafe drinking water? Well, you could certainly argue it's a breaking down of the basic uh, contract between citizen and state in a developed country, because this is one of these things, whilst it might not be articulated in any sort of Bill of Human Rights or any constitution, it's one of those things which is fundamentally understood to be essential to the functioning of a society. So, in that sense, whilst it might not be a human rights violation per se, it's absolutely a failure of governance. Absolutely. And the other infamous, rather than famous, I would say, case in the US right now is, of course, that of Flint, Michigan, which has been suffering horrendous water pollution for several years now, to the point where not only is the water undrinkable, but it's basically unviable for many other things as well because it's so thoroughly polluted. Uh, LA Gardner, the video about Seville, California, saw how water shortages are very much an economic issue in rich countries like the USA due to lack of investment and governments not caring about lower income areas. Yeah, yeah. The underinvestment in agriculture in infrastructure is absolutely a problem in a lot of developed nations, not just the US. Also, it's very much the case in this country as well. Um, a lot of our infrastructure dates uh, back to varying points of the 20th century. And also, a lot of areas, in thinking of California specifically, because of both internal and external migration and because of population growth, what you effectively have is infrastructure that was built on the understanding of a certain population level, which actually now has a much higher population level. And because poverty and population density tend to share quite a strong correlation with one another, this just sort of exacerbates the problem from an inequality level. Paul, to what you said, it seems that denying water is a dangerous game to play since you too can be denied it. It's a dangerous game to play if you're concerned about making an adversary desperate, because desperate adversaries can be unpredictable. And actually, when it comes to economic sanctions, and if we think of denying water as a form of economic sanction, um, economic sanctions which threaten one's adversary in an existential fashion have a nasty habit of blowing up in one's face. Now, I'd cite, for example, in 1940, the US oil embargo on Japan. Now, that was meant to provide Japan an existential threat in order to change the government in Tokyo's behavior. And it absolutely did, but the intended effect was negotiation, not Pearl Harbor. Yet Pearl Harbor's what they got. So, cautionary tale about making a potential adversary desperate. Isla Gardner, also, who can hold countries like the USA to account when they acknowledge that water is a human right, but all their citizens don't have access to it? Well, quite. Uh, Yeah, holding the US to account is an incredibly difficult thing to do because, of course, it is the from an international perspective, it's the sole remaining superpower. It is the uh, actor which strides the top of the current international order. The US has SKK 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm just going to go with SKK from now on. The USA water issues like Ferguson is arguably a racial class issue. Uh, yep, David, yeah, you got that. Excellent. SKK, USA, and Mexico share control over the Colorado River and have a 1944 treaty about managing it. Mexico actually hold their quotas in dams in US territory. Interesting. Thank you very much uh, for that interesting fact there, SKK. Mokos Soria, in a similar way of using water as a weapon, could it also be used as political leverage? It seems that's what China is doing in the Mekong. Oh, absolutely. It can be used. It can be used for leverage in this way because by even inactivity can be used for leverage in a way. For example, by conditionally promising not to dam an area, you could use that as a negotiating counter for something else that you want. This is known in international affairs, by the way. This is known as issue linkage, where you're negotiating about something and you bring in a matter which may be seemingly unrelated, but your interlocutor is interested in it, and it's a way of achieving progress. Isla Gardner, again, Flint, Michigan is a mostly black community, showing how water crises can be heavily racially influenced. Yeah, possibly so. With that particular case, I'd need to do a little bit more research before commenting on that aspect of it specifically, if I'm honest. Mokal Soya, they are providing funding for massive projects downstream without letting much water stream down. That's in relation to the previous comment on the Mekong. Yeah, well, if we've noticed one thing about Chinese foreign policy in the last 20 years, it's that it's exceptionally sophisticated when it comes to creating interesting and novel leverage against its interlocutors. Um, the program of island building in the South and East China Seas is an absolutely brilliant example of this, and actually relates back to what I was saying earlier about China's issues with the Tibet Plateau reducing its potential to grow and therefore its potential to feed its population. The island building program in the South China Sea is very, very similar to this, insofar as a lot of assumptions are made about it being related to exploiting the fairly minor oil rights in the Philippines or off Vietnam, or it's often assumed to be about building military installations in order to offset U.S. carrier groups. Actually, it's about fish. Fish stocks in the South China Sea are about 5% of what they were in 1950, and this is a part of the world where well over a billion people rely on fish as their staple protein. So again, what China is really trying to do here is maximize its share of the resources in order to kind of fend off an impending famine or food shortage, which would bring those very industrious cities on the Chinese coast to a halt. Now, especially if that was compounded by what's going on in the Yangtze and Yellow River basins. So all of these things are interconnected. SKK, it's an interesting idea linked to the California issue as they get water from the river and farming in California is considered highly water intensive compared to elsewhere. Yep, absolutely. Paul, David Toke, I worked with that in Congress. That has to do with the pipes being made of lead. Since remaking all the pipes is hard, the biggest solution put forward is large filters for buildings. Okay, interesting. Thank you very much for that input there. But this does tie back in then to the infrastructure question and just how much of the infrastructure of even developed countries at this stage is really no longer fit for purpose. And it's obviously an immense undertaking of logistics of resources to start fixing that, putting it right, and updating infrastructure as well. So it's not just necessarily that governments are lazy and incompetent, although that can happen. Um, it's also that actually this is an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially in very sort of large, very urbanized countries. Ahmad, as a form of inequality, I watched a documentary of how illegal immigrants and lower class people's water was extremely unhygienic, and they've been drinking it for decades. Uh, I'm not entirely sure. Oh, this was in California. Okay. Yep, yep. There's an absolutely powerful correlation here between poverty and poorer access to good infrastructure across the board, but that includes water as well. Paul, we need to act fast. Filters are quick to keep kids from drinking lead. Yep, yeah. I mean that might not be the longest term solution, but it's certainly better than nothing, and it'll do in a pinch. I mean, it seems that the situation in Flint is one which kind of requires really any response that works. Then we can find the pipes over time, and that is the plan that was presented. That seems a perfectly logical way of going about it. I mean, I'm no expert in crisis relief or disaster management, but from a basic logistical point of view. Ahmad, the American government aren't going to help out the illegals drinking it, and they don't seem to care for the poor. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I'm sure it can certainly look that way at times. Yeah. Well, the thing is with kind of making a statement as well, like aren't going to help out illegals. I mean, by definition, undocumented migrants aren't on the system. They aren't on the registry. There might be a vague sort of knowledge of where these individuals or communities are, but by definition, it's very very hard to actually manage populations that you have very very limited information about. Okay, I've just reached the end of the chat for now, but by all means, please keep the messages coming in for the next 5-10 minutes or so. Right, and just while we're waiting for a few more comments and points, the last case study from the lecture materials that I haven't quite that we haven't talked about much is the case of Bangladesh. Bangladesh being a part of the world that's suffering intense water insecurity, largely relative insecurity in this particular case rather than absolute, but no less pronounced for it. And this is really what I was getting at as well with what factors surrounding perhaps geography or history can enhance or deteriorate water security. Bangladesh is unfortunately a country which has enjoyed a very, very contentious past, both through civil wars, acts of genocide, the essentially the depopulation of the educated classes during the struggle that moved Bangladesh into an independent state as opposed to East Pakistan as it was from the 40s to the 60s, and basically that involved not just a brain drain, but a fundamental kind of decapitation of those who were educated. So this does nothing for things like large infrastructure projects over time. It does nothing for development. So these issues which come up, even though they were there decades ago, combined with what is quite often a very unfortunate hand when it comes to being very reliant on the weather for enough rain, enough water for agriculture, water for domestic consumption, means it's an incredibly precarious state and actually suffering from a number of different variables which are kind of locking it in this cycle of poverty and inequality. Right, okay. We're almost at 5-2, and it seems as if chat's kind of petered away a little bit. So I think we'll call the first session a day there. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. Thank you very much for your input, and thank you for your patience and your forbearance. I know this hasn't ran quite as smoothly as we would have wanted, um, but I think as a first session, it's worked out not too bad, in the grand scheme of things. If anyone has any comments or suggestions about anything like the quality of the audio or quality of the stream itself, please do shoot me an email with those. Um, or any suggestions to kind of improve this. This is the first time I've run a tutorial in this way, so I'm very much open to feedback and suggestions. But thank you very much indeed, and have a good day, and look after yourselves, everyone. And I will see you tomorrow. Well, see you, so to speak, tomorrow for the second stream on climate change and inequality. Thank you very much indeed, and good day.